So today we are going to cover the Glintstone Staves, which actually is the last of the weapon categories that we're going to be ranking. That means all 40 of them are now done. Now that is not including the tools and the torches, but I'm not going to bother talking about those anyway. So yes, we can finally move on after this one. Now the Staves, which are very much like the Sacred Seals which we just covered, are going to be catalysts to help cast the spells, which in this instance is going to be the sorceries. And honestly, it feels like the design process between the seals and the Staves are just very different. It feels like they were made by two separate teams that is like did not talk to each other at all. Mainly being is that there's twice as many Staves as there are seals, and it feels like half of them just don't really need to exist. And a lot of the Staves have these really high requirements, which typically the ones with higher requirements tend to be your best ones as well. So you're using a lot of different types of staves throughout your entire playthrough if you did want to make an optimal build. Whereas as for the seals, a lot of them have really low requirements. You can get them early on in the game, and they're just much easier to build around as well. Now I think the most disappointing thing about the staves is that there's nothing for strength or dexterity. There's not a single one that actually is meant for these hybrid types of builds. Now there is staves out there that actually do have a strength scaling, but that strength scaling doesn't actually help boost the spell damage at all. It actually just meant to boost the damage of like the stick. That is it. So when you are making these hybrid types of builds, you're probably going to benefit more if using like the staves that are better at these lower levels, because unfortunately there really isn't anything for them. Now to say which staff is actually the best one in the game is going to be a really hard question, because as I mentioned, all the best ones have really high requirements, and there are so many different types of staves that there's never going to be one that's like optimal throughout most of your playthrough. Now on screen right now is like the breakdown of which staff performs best at which level when it does come to these pure intelligence types of builds. Now the thing is, this chart actually assumes the weapon is actually at max level, which if you're early in the game, you're not going to have like a maxed out plus 25 weapon. And the existence of the meteorite staff kind of makes this list a bit silly. Now the way I would actually go about it if I were to make like a pure intelligence build is that I would start off the game with just the regular basic stuff that your starting class gives you. If it didn't go with a sorcery starting class, then I would just pick up the DEMI-HUMAN stuff up until I get to about 18 intelligence, and then I would switch to the meteorite stuff, and then I actually would use the meteorite stuff up until you killed Morgott, and then you can get the smithing bell bearing 3, and at that point you can actually buy enough smithing stones to get a plus 18 weapon. And then from there I'd actually go switch to the CARIAN Glintstone Staff. Even though it's not one of the highest damaging staffs, it actually does boost some of the best spells like CARIAN Slicer and CARIAN Piercer. But if you actually didn't care for those spells, then I actually would use the Academy Glintstone Staff instead, up until you get to about 68 intelligence, and then I would switch to the CARIAN Regal Scepter, and I would use the CARIAN Regal Scepter up until you got to about 35 to 40 mind, and then I'll switch to the LUSAT'S Glintstone Staff, because this is the highest damaging intelligence staff, but actually does make you consume 50% more FP, so it's going to be better if you have these higher levels of mind. But yeah, that's basically the most important information of the entire video, so if you just needed that, feel free to leave, but I am going to talk about every single staff and rank them all from worst to best. Now do keep in mind, this is just going to be for PvE, and once again focus more on actually what I'm saying about the staves, more so than actually where I rank them, because as I mentioned, every single staff does have its specific use, and there is not really one best one. Starting off at the bottom, we have the Glintstone Staff, which actually is one of the lowest damaging staffs from start to finish. Now, you could potentially say that it's a good early game option, but the only way to really get it is by starting off with the Prisoner class. Otherwise, you'd have to farm for it. And a lot of the other staffs that you can get pretty early on in the game, like the Astrologer's staff that you get with the Astrologer's class, is just going to be a better option. Now, this one actually only does have a 10 intelligence requirement, but so does the Demi-Human's Queen staff. And this one is actually just better throughout the entirety of early game. And you can also get this one pretty early on as well. Number 20, the Rotten Crystal Staff, which is actually the closest thing that you actually can get to useless in this entire game, because it performs basically identical to the regular Crystal Staff in terms of its requirements, the fact that it can boost your crystal-based sorceries, and even the damage is very similar, and the damage actually can be pretty good, especially at these higher levels. But the thing is, it just gets worse damage than the regular Crystal Staff. At every single level, the regular Crystal Staff can just outperform it, and you get that one earlier in the game, but the only benefits the Rotten Crystal Staff gets is that you can get passive rot buildup when you actually whack with the staff itself, which might have been pretty useful if you could infuse it with like spinning weapon, but you can't infuse this thing at all. So if you wanted to proc rot with this thing, you have to start hitting with your very bad damaging staff and only doing like 50 rot buildup per hit. So it's going to take like 20 hits just to be able to proc rot on like any single boss. And in that instance, you might as well just use like a +0 Scarlet Rot weapon, which unironically is probably just going to do more damage and just proc rot faster. But even then, it's only going to be the 15% damage of rot over that's 90 seconds. And in the time that you actually go ahead and try and proc rot, you're better off just using your damaging based spells, and you'll just benefit more. Number 19, the Digger Staff, another pure intelligence staff that you can get relatively early on in the game. Does have pretty low requirements too, but just the damage throughout every single level is just really bad. And the fact that you have to farm for it makes me basically never want to use it. Now, the only benefit that it actually does serve is that it can boost your Stone Digger sorceries by 20%, which do include Rock Blast and Shatter Earth, which are okay spells. There are going to be better close range options out there for you, but these actually can do some nice damage and actually do some decent stance damage. So if you wanted to use these spells, you could just throw this stuff in your offhand and benefit that way, but that's basically going to be its only use. Number 18, the CARIAN Sorcery Sword, which I actually did cover this in my Thrusting Sword video, but the heavy attack of this weapon does cast sorceries, so might as well include it into this one. Now, for the most part, it is a very mediocre damaging Thrusting Sword, and in terms of its spell casting abilities, they're actually pretty poor as well, unless you're at about 40 intelligence. In fact, 41 intelligence, it actually can be the highest damaging staff in the game, but that's only if you're at this one specific level, because literally before this, the Demi-Human staff is going to be better, and above this, the Academy Glintstone staff, and basically every other staff is just going to do more damage, because this thing actually does suffer off some pretty severe damage fall off. And by the time that you actually get this weapon in the DLC, you're more likely than not going to be above 40 intelligence anyway. So there's no real reason to use it other than the fact that you think it's actually pretty fun, because you actually like the idea of having a weapon catalyst in general. And it can be pretty convenient as well. One thing that I actually would have liked is if it actually had a unique skill that helps complement the spells. Like maybe give it some like poise or hyper armor casting with the skill. Or maybe have the skill just be like a weapon buff that just boosts your spell damage by like 20% or something. That would have been nice, but yeah, in its current state, it's not that good. Number 17, the AZUR'S Glintstone Staff, which actually is a very average damaging staff that has really high requirements. So in most cases, to like maximize your damage, you're just best going elsewhere. But this thing actually does have the benefit of boosting your casting speed, as by having it equipped does give you a plus 40 to virtual dexterity, which means that some of your spells can come out a few frames faster, which obviously is really nice and can result in higher DPS. But the trade-off being is that it makes your spells cost 20% more FP, which is just not worth it in my opinion, because something like the Radagon's Icon can boost your casting speed by a plus 30 virtual dexterity, and that one doesn't have any negative side effect at all. Now, you can actually use this staff as an offhand option and still benefit without even having to meet the requirements, but I would just rather offhand a seal or a staff that has boosted a particular set of spells, more so than one that actually improves your spell casting speed, especially because this one actually has a negative side effect. But if you actually are using some spells that actually don't have a seal or a staff to boost the damage, and if you have like really high amounts of mind to where it doesn't really matter, then yeah, you might as well just put this one in the offhand, but that's its only use. Number 16, the Maternal Staff, which you acquire in the DLC. This one actually being one of the ones that actually scale off both Arcane and Intelligence, which Arcane and Intelligence builds are not really that amazing because obviously there's very limited weapon options. There's no infusion for them, and the spells that actually do have requirements in Arcane and Intelligence are very mediocre for the most part as well. But the main reason why this one's going to get as low as it does is because it's still not even the best Intelligence Arcane option, as the ALBINAURIC staff just basically outdamages it at most levels up until you get to about like 65 Intelligence Arcane, and once you get at that point, then the Maternal Staff is better. So it's only really good at higher levels with a very niche build type. Now, a lot of people might point towards things like Impenetrable Thorns, because that is a sorcery that actually does do bleed, and with an arcane scaling staff, it actually can improve the bleed build-up. And for some reason, this one actually can improve the bleed build-up more so than the ALBINAURIC stuff, despite that one actually having a better arcane scaling. But the thing is, Impenetrable Thorns does have a faith requirement of roughly 25. So you're actually going into a decent amount of faith and having to level up a lot of arcane and intelligence just the benefit of using this one spell, which if you're at higher levels, not that bad of an option. But for the most part, this is just going to be an offhand option to boost your finger sorceries, which is the only reason why this actually does get into the B tier, because a 15% boost to these spells are actually really good, because stuff like Glintstone Nails or Fleeting Microcosm can be amazing projectile options. But other than that, I wouldn't bother using it. Number 15, the GELMIR Glintstone Staff, which is one of the few intelligence faith-based staves in the game. Now, the two others can actually get more damage in both the Staff of the Great Beyond and the Prince of the Death Staff. Now, the Prince of the Death Staff only outdamages it once you get to like really high amounts of levels, and the Staff of the Great Beyond is in the DLC. So basically, throughout the entire base game, with an intelligence faith-based build, the GELMIR Glintstone Staff is going to be the one that you actually want to use. Now, as I've always mentioned with intelligence faith-based builds, they're not going to get as much play because there are hardly any weapon options. So inherently, a staff like this is not going to be as useful. Most people that actually spec into intelligence faith-based builds are at really high levels. And if you're at higher levels, once again, the other ones are going to perform better. And if you are going to go with an intelligence faith-based build at earlier levels, you're probably not going to really use this staff much anyway, because you're probably going to have the Golden Order Seal as well. And the Golden Order Seal gets way higher scalings, and it can just get way more damage with its incantations. But you still could just use the GELMIR's Glintstone Staff to just cast some sorceries, because it is pretty useful to just have some magic damage or just be able to proc frost. And also you could just use this to boost your magma-based sorceries by 15%, which with an intelligence faith-based build, I wouldn't really care for it, because the fire-based incantations are just going to be way better in my opinion. And I think the major benefit of the magma-based sorceries is that they're a way to do fire damage with like an intelligence-based build, because you don't really have to spec into much faith to actually use some of these spells. But if I were to use them, you could just throw this stuff in the offhand. Number 14, the ALBINAURIC staff, which this stuff does scale primarily off arcane and a little bit of intelligence. So this thing is basically the equivalent of the dragon communion seal, but just for the sorceries instead. Now the thing is, it's just not going to be anywhere near as useful because the dragon communion seal does just get you a lot more damage with an arcane build. And that one also just like weighs nothing, has lower requirements, can get it earlier in the game. It requires summer stones, and it actually boosts the dragon communion incantations, whereas the ALBINAURIC staff boosts basically nothing. Now thankfully it actually only has a 10 intelligence requirement. And if you actually wanted to use some pretty cheap types of sorceries alongside an arcane build, you could go ahead and do that. But the thing is, as I mentioned with the Dragon Communion Seal, you already have access to frost-based spells and magic-based spells in things like Dragon Ice or Glintstone Breath. So there's nothing really that the ALBINAURIC staff can actually offer you in terms of a pure arcane build, even though it actually can get some pretty respectable damage. I'm still not going to want to use it unless I am actually using the Thorn-based sorceries. Because as I always mention, if you're going to go with an arcane build, I recommend just going into a little bit of faith, just so you can use some incantations. And when going into a little bit of faith, you can also just use the thorn sorceries. And stuff like Briars of Punishment and Impenetrable Thorns can actually be pretty decent as like a ranged based option to proc bleed. And with the ALBINAURIC staff, it actually can improve the bleed buildup of these spells. So with its pure arcane builds, this is going to be its only use. But as for like a hybrid intelligence and arcane build, it's still going to be your best option, but there's not many weapons out there that can actually help accompany this outside of like an occult-infused Clayman's Harpoon or a magic-infused Bloodfiend's Fork, which these weapons are not optimal with these infusions anyway, but it can still be pretty viable. Number 13, the Staff of the Guilty, which actually is a pure faith-based scaling staff, which actually is very interesting. Just being able to just access some sorceries with a pure faith build can be pretty cool, because actually can give you access to magic damage or the frost status effect. So I think something like Glintstone Icecrag can be pretty good, doesn't require much stat investment, and you can just get some respectable damage. Now the thing is, the sorcery scaling of the Staff of the Guilty is like honestly worse than like the incant scaling of a Finger Seal. Like at every single level, it just gets outdamaged by it. So it's not going to be the most useful thing, unless you just wanted to use it to just have different coverage of damage types. And also if you just were to use the Thorn-based sorceries, because this stuff does actually boost them by 15%. And these spells actually do also have a pure faith requirement. So it's not like you have to spec into any intelligence just to be able to benefit. And these also do magic damage as well, which there's not many things in this game that are weaker to magic damage. So having coverage in this area doesn't really mean much, but having a bleed-based ranged option can be pretty good for a faith build too. And for the most part with a faith build, I probably wouldn't even bother. There are other different types of incantations that I would just rather have equipped, and going through the effort of leveling up this stuff and farming for it might be a bit too tedious. Number 12, the Demi-Human Queen's Staff, which actually this is one of the best early game options in the entire game. In fact, between the levels of 10 and 40 intelligence, this one is the highest damaging staff. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this doesn't really mean much, as it does assume that your weapon is actually maxed out, and at early game, you're not going to have like a plus 25 Demi-Human staff. So the existence of the Meteorite staff kind of just makes this a bit obsolete, because the Meteorite staff already does come maxed out. It actually can't be upgraded at all. It does actually get pretty poor scalings. But the Meteorite staff at like 30 to 40 intelligence is the equivalent of having a plus 20 Demi-Human's Queen staff, which you're not going to have a plus 20 weapon until at least you reach the Altus plateau. And at that point, if you have around about 30 to 40 intelligence, you're probably just better off just going with another staff instead. Because past 40 intelligence, the Demi-Human's Queen staff is just not good at all. In fact, almost every other intelligence staff can just outdamage it. So you're just best off going in another direction, because you're eventually going to get above that level. So the only real use of this staff is to be paired alongside a hybrid build like Strength Intelligence or Dexterity Intelligence. And no, the strength scaling of this stuff doesn't actually boost the sorcery scaling at all. It's just there to just boost the damage of the weapon itself. But the reason why I still say it's good for hybrid builds is because if you're using a weapon that doesn't really have that good of an intelligence scaling, and that's going to involve you being around about 30 to 40 intelligence by the time you get towards the end of the game, this is still going to be the best stuff to use. But having like a 40 intelligence Demi-Human Queen staff is still not going to be that good in terms of damage, especially at the end of the game. Number 11, the Astrologer's staff. Now, there are going to be some people out there that just don't really care to have to constantly switch their staffs and pick the most optimal option for their specific level, and they just want to use a staff from start to finish and just have it be perfectly fine. This is literally the option for you. You get the Astrologer staff with the Astrologer starting class, and it can get some of the most damage throughout every single level. At 40 intelligence, it only really gets outdamaged by the Demi-Human's Queen staff, but unlike the Demi-Human's Queen staff, it actually performs pretty good at later levels too. and it can like consistently be like top 5 or even top 3 in terms of damage with a pure intelligence build. So if you actually didn't want to go through all the hassle of picking up another staff and leveling up that one as well, I would just recommend using this one. Now, it's obviously not going to get any higher because it's never going to be the most optimal staff to use, and it also just doesn't boost any other different types of spells. But if you just wanted a plain, simple staff from start to finish, it's not going to get much better than this one. Number 10, the Prince of the Death's Staff, which this is literally the highest damaging staff in the entire game. Now, that is only if you're at like really high levels or like max level, because otherwise there is just no real reason to use it, as it is a faith and intelligence based staff, and things like the GELMIR Glintstone Staff and the Staff of the Great Beyond can just outdamage it up until you get to around about 65 intelligence faith, and then you can go ahead and switch to it, because that's how bad the damage actually performs at lower levels. In fact, at 99 intelligence, LUSAT'S Glintstone Staff can actually get like basically just as much damage as this staff at 80. So basically, if you're anything below level 300, I wouldn't even bother touching this staff at all, unless you just wanted to use it as an offhand option to boost your death sorceries, which the death sorceries are like one of the worst spell schools in the entire game. Half the options are just terrible and the other half are just outclassed, but it still gets to the top 10 because it is the highest damaging one. Number 9, the Academy Glintstone Staff, which this is the best staff between the levels of 41 intelligence and 68 intelligence. So honestly, once you actually meet the requirements of around about 28 intelligence, I would just like start to level this one up because you're going to be using this one for most of your playthrough. Now, the thing is, for me personally, I probably wouldn't really care for it as much as things like the CARIAN GLINTBLADE or the CARIAN Glintstone Staff, because those things don't really get that much less damage, but they are going to be lighter, have less requirements, and also just boost the damage of particular types of spells, because unfortunately the Academy Glintstone Staff doesn't boost any spells whatsoever. And just being able to boost things like CARIAN Slicer, CARIAN Piercer, Magic Glintblade, or your Phalanx types of spells, I think this benefit is just going to be much more valuable in my opinion, and it's just going to make me want to lean more towards those. But if you didn't really care to use many of those spells, then I would just go with the Academy Glintstone Staff instead, especially because you can just put those CARIAN staffs in your offhand anyway. But most builds out there aren't going to really just have 2 staffs equipped at all times, and more likely than not, you're just going to have the 1 staff. So that's the reason why I do value those ones better, but the Academy Glintstone Staff is still deserving of an A tier. Number 8, the Staff of the Great Beyond, which is a faith and intelligence staff that you do acquire in the DLC. And as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be the best faith int staff to use up until you get to around about 65 intelligence and faith, and then you would probably switch to the Prince of the Death staff. Now, the thing is, that is a big chunk of the game that you can play with this staff until you can switch. But the main reason why I'm still going to value it a bit more is that it actually does give you the ability to cast sorceries and incantations at the same time, which if you were to cast incantations, there is no point where this thing is better than the Golden Order Seal with a faith intelligence build, as this one can be acquired earlier in the game, it's lower requirements, and at basically every level, it's just going to outdamage it. But the convenience of casting multiple different types of spells with just one catalyst is obviously going to be amazing, and there are some incantations out there that you can just benefit off without even needing to have high amounts of scaling. So things like status effect proc spells, some buffs, or other types of spells that just do amazing damage no matter what. You could just pair these perfectly fine alongside the Staff of the Great Beyond. But if you did want to optimize a faith intelligence build, it's probably not going to be the best option. Number 7, the CARIAN Glintblade Staff. Now, as I mentioned with the Academy Glintstone Staff, this one gets basically just as much damage, but actually does give you the ability to boost your Glintblade sorceries by 15%, which do include your Phalanx spells, Magic Glintblade and Glintblade Trio, which are some pretty okay spells for the most part, but this could very well just be your mid to late game option. After you switched off the Meteorite staff, between the levels of 30 to 68 intelligence, you could just use this stuff and just benefit of some of the most damage. Now, the reason why it's still not going to get higher is because I still prefer the CARIAN Glintstone staff instead. Even though it doesn't get as much damage as the Glintblade staff, it's going to boost the damage of things like CARIAN Slicer, CARIAN Piercer, and Ardala's Moonblade, which are just some of the best spells in the entire game in my opinion. Which, if you did want to use those spells, you could just maximize the damage by just having that stuff in your offhand, but it's still going to perform basically just as good as a primary option too. Number 6, the Crystal Staff, which this thing actually does get some of the highest sorcery scaling in the entire game at these higher amounts of levels. In fact, it can get basically just as much as the CARIAN Regal Scepter. And honestly, there are some people out there that might prefer the Crystal Staff because it also does boost your crystal sorceries by 10%, whereas the CARIAN Regal Scepter boosts your moon sorceries by 10%, which those spells are kind of just meant for debuffs anyway. So getting a damage boost to your crystal sorceries is just going to be more beneficial, especially because all the crystal spells are pretty decent. Now, that is only once you get to like really high levels, because at those medium levels, or at least for when you meet the requirements, it's not going to be as good. But this could very well to still be a solid primary option, as you can get it pretty early in the game, and it does only require Somber Stones, and it still does get some of the highest damage. Number 5, the Staff of Loss, which is one of the lowest damaging staffs in the game. Doesn't matter what's level, from start to finish, it can be outclassed by a lot of others in terms of sorcery scaling, but the main reason why it's going to get in the top 5 is because it boosts your night sorceries by 30%, which your night sorceries include Night Comet, which is probably like the best spell in the entire game. This thing is utterly broken, it does insane DPS. It goes really far, you can spam it over and over again, and it's invisible to enemies, so no one's going to be able to dodge it either. And as bad as a sorcery scaling is of this stuff, when using these particular spells, you can actually get more damage than things like a CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER, and sometimes even the LUSAT'S stuff too. If you manage to get a second one in New Game Plus and put it in your offhand, this thing is just going to destroy everything in the entire game. But if you didn't really care to use Night Comet, then this stuff is practically useless. Number 4, the Meteorite staff, which this is the best staff to use early game, as it kind of already comes maxed out. It just doesn't get upgraded at all. It just like stays at +0, but it gets like a very high base sorcery scaling. Now once you get to higher levels, the thing just sucks, because compared to every other stuff at +25 or +10, it's just not going to be anywhere near as good. But it's basically going to outperform every other stuff like at +15. When you are around about like 30 to 40 intelligence, and you're not really going to be able to get like a +15 stuff until you reach things like the Altus Plateau. So I would just use this stuff until I fight someone like Morgott, and once I get the Bell Bearing and the Mountaintops to actually get a +18 weapon, then I'll just end up switching to something else. But yeah, that's the main reason why it gets into the S tier, is because it's such a good early game option. But even outside of that, it's still going to be good as an offhand option, because it boosts your gravity spells by 30%, which your gravity spells are actually really good, especially now with some of the DLC ones. There's a bunch of S tier options here, and in almost every single sorcery build, I just recommend using some gravity spells, because with intelligence, you're going to have a lot of access to magic damage, but not really of many other damage types, and the gravity spells, for some of them, just do pure physical damage. So yes, basically every single intelligence build has benefits of using the Meteorite stuff. At number 3, the CARIAN Glintstone Staff. Now this is the stuff that I recommend to use after you actually finished using the Meteorite stuff. Probably once you get to about Lendel, or afterwards, you could just go ahead and level this thing up. And between the levels of like 40 to like 68 intelligence, I would probably just end up using this one. Now, it's not going to get as much damage as things like the Academy Glintstone stuff or the CARIAN GLINTBLADE stuff, but this one actually is easier to acquire. It does actually get lower requirements than the Academy Glintstone stuff, but the main reason why I am going to prefer it is because it does actually boost some of the best sorceries in the game. CARIAN Slicer, CARIAN Piercer, and Ardala's Moonblade. So at the very least, you could just use this as an offhand option, but I would just probably just leave it as my main option, because in most times, if you are going to be using an intelligence build, you're still going to have a weapon to accompany you, so it's not like you have every opportunity to use 2 different staves at once. But once again, if you didn't really care to use things like CARIAN Slicer or CARIAN Piercer, then it's going with the Academy Glintstone stuff in this instance is going to be the better option. At number 2, the LUSAT'S Glintstone Staff, which this is the highest damaging intelligence staff in the entire game. Once you get to 52 intelligence, nothing is going to outdamage this one. Now the trade-off being is that it makes your sorceries cost 50% more FP, and the damage difference is not really that high. In fact, once you get to around about 80 intelligence, it's only going to do 12% more damage than the CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER. Now 12% more damage is still really good, but it's probably not worth the 50% extra FP cost unless you have really high amounts of mind. So the way I would actually build around my intelligence character is that once I actually reach about 68 intelligence, I would use the CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER all the way up until you reach about 80 intelligence, and then I'll start dumping my points into mind, and maybe once I actually reach about 35 to 40 mind, and then I'd probably comfortably use the LUSAT stuff. You can still very well just use it earlier on, but I think for most people, you want to have a lot of minds just to be able to compensate for that extra FP cost. And at number 1, we have the CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER. Now, as I've been mentioning, this is not necessarily the best option in the entire game, as at every single level, there are going to be different types of staves that are just better than others. And for the CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER, it is going to get outclassed by the LUSAT staff, but that's only when you have a comfortable amount of mind, and that's going to eventually get outclassed by the Prince of the Death staff. But the reason why the CARIAN REGAL SCEPTER gets at number 1 is because once you actually get to 68 intelligence and above, this is the highest damaging one that does not give you a negative side effects like the LUSAT staff gives. And if you do have a pure intelligence build, you're probably going to be at around about 70 to 80 intelligence by the time you actually reach endgame. So you're going to be fighting all the hardest bosses in the game, all the DLC bosses, and like a good chunk of New Game Plus with this particular staff. So that's the main reason why I consider it to be the most useful one. It also does boost your moon sorceries by 10%, which doesn't really mean much because half of those sorceries are just meant for debuffing options. And this is the only staff in the game that does have its own unique skill in Spinning Weapon, which is like a slightly different version of like the regular Spinning Weapon, as it does just shoot it out a lot further. It stun locks pretty well, does like a lot more damage, which there might be other spells in the game that could just probably do this better anyway. But this skill is pretty efficient, and you could just use this as like your primary close range option, and you could just save a spell slot for something else. Okay, that's now finally done. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. But yeah, that's basically every single ranking video now done. All 40 weapon types, not including the tools and the torches, because I'm not going to bother talking about those. They're all now ranked. I probably just have them all in a nice little playlist. You can probably just go check that down in the description. But from this point on, I'm probably going to make some more build videos. I probably do plan on like ranking all like the spells and the Ashes of War, which is going to be like over 100 of every single one. So definitely do subscribe for those videos. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.